So thank you for this very warm welcome. The topic of my talk tonight is very relevant to the space that we're in. And I'm an objects conservator. What that means is I am responsible for the preservation of art and historic artifacts within historic collections. My other interest is in occupational health and safety. And so those come together to what I specialize in, which is historic hazards and hazardous collection materials. So what does that mean? Like, what is a hazardous collection material? So I think if you've ever tried to hang a painting, a large painting, I think this picture might, might be, you might empathize with this. So a hazard within the museum, within a museum collection or a historic collection really ranges from anything from being a large, heavy object to a chemical toxin within, say, a pharmaceutical collection. That is a very wide topic to talk about in 45 minutes. So what I have sort of tried to do here is focus on things related to the late 19th and 20th centuries, which is sort of, what this building is centered on, that have an occupational health and safety story behind them in the way that they were manufactured. Because within objects conservation, I'm fascinated by how things were made. And so there are many things where hazardous materials were incorporated into objects in a scenario that was hazardous for the workforce. And those in this period, in the Victorian period, really started to get publicized, and there was sort of public outrage, and that led to a lot of changes in occupational health and safety that we see today. And it sort of originated with these scenarios. So I've tried to pick stories that maybe you've kind of heard of before, but what you might not be aware of is sort of the consequences of what happens with those objects when they go into a historic collection, and how museum workers, or even if you have them in your home, like, should you be concerned that you have these hazardous materials in these historic artifacts? So, this is not okay. I might be one of few 10-year-old girls living in Vermont that did my 5th grade book report on the jungle. And it sort of, piqued my interest in sort of understanding occupational health and safety. And I think, given where we are in the country, I probably don't have to explain what the importance of this was on the meatpacking industry, and sort of revealing, the unsanitary and hazardous conditions that were happening in the meatpacking industry. And it was sort of muckraking journalists like this who got these stories out that really motivated people to change the working conditions, both here in the United States and really throughout the world. My reading habits have not changed that much in the past 30 years. So now I'm reading things like this, Exploring the Dangerous Trades, which is an autobiography of Alice Hamilton, who was really like the mother of modern occupational health and safety. And the way that she approached occupational health and safety was in a really holistic way, that we were not just looking at how the working conditions that workers had within their factories or wherever they were, but also how the effect that it had on the communities. And health and safety in the workplace doesn't just stay at the workplace. If you get sick, you are bringing it home. It's affecting your family. It's affecting your community. And the working conditions at this time really had massive impacts on the communities that they were in. So she also was really instrumental in a couple of the case studies that I'm going to talk about. And primarily, one of the areas that I'm interested in is why workers choose to stay in these hazardous jobs, right? So we know sort of implicitly that there's an exploited workforce here. They tend to be women and children and people who are poor and have no other choice. But when we look at these, the objects that are produced, there's another side of that as well, which is that there's a lot of skill that goes into creating these things. And people have a lot of pride in what they're doing. And when you try to change their job or take away their job or tell them that they're not doing something correctly, you see this kind of cognitive dissonance of pushback of people trying to change their work practices because it's their livelihoods. And one of the ways that we see this is one of the things that Alice Hamilton was doing was with stone workers. And stone cutters disease or stone workers disease is one of the most historic sort of occupational illnesses. She looked specifically at granite workers in Vermont. Granite is a high silica containing stone, and every process in granite working, from the quarrying to the finishing, produces respirable silica. So this is a disease we now know it's silicosis, and it's entirely preventable, yet people still get this occupational illness even today. So it's actually particularly prevalent now that we have these engineered stone countertops and things. We see a resurgence in silicosis. The quotes that I'm putting up here, I'm not going to read them for you, but it's basically like they're doing this hazardous work, even though they know they're going to get sick, because it's a livelihood that they're supporting their families. And also, again, this notion of if you take away their job, you're taking away their purpose in life. And so there is going to be some kind of pushback. A good example of this is Luigi Del Bianco, who is one of the lead carvers on Mount Rushmore. When they did his autopsy, they just, his lungs were just full of silicosis. And, in 1966, when he gave this interview, which was 3 years before he died, he said, "I'd do it again, even knowing all the hardship was involved. I would work at Mount Rushmore, even without pay if necessary. It was a great privilege granted to me." So there is this sense of pride and artistry that keeps people working in these hazardous conditions. Okay, so why do these objects contain hazardous materials in the first place? I think we can have the historical perspective to look back now that we know what we know about radium and asbestos, and sort of think that these are sort of laughable conditions that people would use these materials in this way. I think that history will not be kind to us, and that in 100 years from now, we will find a lot of similar situations with the commercial products that we use today. But they're in there for a reason. So, radium was this cure-all, it was good for your skin. It did all these things, it was promoted as being really like a cure for things. Asbestos does have this really great quality of being fireproof and a good insulator. It just also happens to have this really horrible outcome when you're exposed to sort of the fibers of it. And then, the lead and crystal serves a purpose. Like, you get a very brilliant, reflective, clear glass, which is what people have been trying throughout history to achieve, and you get it by adding this very high percentage of lead to your glass. And then these beautiful pigments that create these dresses and these wallpapers and these paintings all contain heavy metals that at the time, this was the easiest way that they were able to achieve these things. So I'm just going to kind of go through a couple of these and sort of highlight how we find them in museums. And sort of, I apologize that this is a short talk and I'm just going to give you enough information to get you curious and maybe a little bit afraid, but I'm not going to actually be able to give you all the answers. So I'm happy to answer questions afterwards, but this is really just sort of an awareness lecture to kind of to let you know that these things are out there and sometimes hidden within our collections. So again, radium, all kinds of radiation, we're sort of seen as this, cure-all of things. And we now know that, this is not the case. There's like a very significant health impact from being associated, being exposed to these things. How do we see them in collections? We generally tend to see uranium and radium. So uranium was used as a colorant, and we see it in this, it's called Vaseline or depression glass. This is highly collectible because it does this lovely thing where it fluoresces this beautiful green color under UV light. So you'll see collectors with their UV lights in antique shops looking for this uranium glass. The other one is in Fiesta ware, the orange color of this Fiesta ware. You can see here from the dosimetry reader that you actually can see the radiation coming off of these objects when you measure it. The other one is radium. So again, radium was in medicines and all these other things. It is particularly well known for creating these radioluminescent paints, which I think maybe we've all heard of now because it was a book and a movie that recently came out of the Radium Girls, who were these factory workers who were specifically instructed to point the brushes in their mouth so that they could get a nice, number on the dials. And that was to save money so that they weren't wasting rags and all these other things. This is one of the first instances where they were able to sue their employer and prove that it was an occupational situation that was causing their illness. This had a big impact in sort of how we look at health and safety, not because they were able to declare that radium was bad for you, like radium was still used in this way up until the 1970s, but that the employers had to train their workers on proper safety protocols, and that seems logical to us now, but was not at the time. So they had a hard time, proving that it was the radium that was making them sick. The radium exposure, because it was in their mouth, they were getting something that was very similar to what it was known as phossy jaw, which is another occupational illness from matchmakers. So these matchmakers were using white phosphorus, which is also extremely toxic, and getting these, oral diseases. So the radium girls were being accused of being promiscuous and unhygienic, and it was really an important part of occupational health and safety history that they were able to prove that it was occupational work practices that were causing these health issues. What does that mean in a museum collection or a historic collection? You might have one, dial in your home or something like that. For air and space museums, they have hundreds of these. So how do they deal with this problem? Radiation is complicated in that it really depends on the type of radiation you have, how you're exposed. In many cases, your skin is an okay barrier, but once it's internalized, your tissues and organs are very sensitive to radiation. So how that manifests sort of in the museum environment is that this paint becomes very friable, and so it starts to flake off. And so now you have your workspaces and your exhibits and all of these things that are being contaminated with radiation. It's good in that it's very easy to detect radiation because all you need is a dosimeter or a Geiger counter, but it's also invisible. So there's no way that it's there unless you're going to look for it. And just, to give you context, we get radiation just from living on the planet Earth, right? So there's a certain level of radiation that we live with every day, medical procedures we get, and we get exposure. And so we have to put in context. And so when people go and they take the readings of these, how long can we be working with these objects? Can we put them behind a barrier? Can we consolidate the paint so they're not flaking? And how do we sort of deal with them in that way if we can't just get rid of them altogether? Another big problem with ingestion of things is lead. Lead is everywhere in the world. It's in our pipes, it was in our gasoline, it was in our paint. The lead industry did a very good job of trying to convince people that lead was good for you. And so it was not until the 1970s when there was a clear correlation made between lead exposure and cognitive and behavioral changes, negative cognitive and behavioral changes in children, that this really sort of changed the way that we think about lead. And I like to show this graph because sort of the units on this doesn't matter, but in the 1960s, you can see that, the level of lead that they thought where you started to see health effects related to lead exposure compared to where we are in 2012, right? So it went from 60 to 5. I think today we think of this would be criminal, like literally it would be criminal to be exposed to just lead. And now we see with just this amount, we start to see behavioral changes in children. And so this mantra, in toxicology and public health is no lead is good lead. And so if you can just get lead out of your life, everything will be better for everyone. So how do we see that in museums? Here's just a few examples of the way that we see lead within historic collections. Lead crystal is historically was about 24% lead is what categorized lead crystal as crystal. Stained glass, all the little pieces around the glass, because lead is so pliable, it's great for sort of encasing the glass. Silk was originally sold by weight, so they added these metallic salts to make them heavier so that you could charge more. And then, of course, it's very easy to cast, so it's great for casting these little trinkets and lead paint and people do actually cast very large sculptures out of lead. I think all the little turtles at Versailles at the fountains are made of lead. So how can we sort of identify these? So lead, because lead is so heavy, just physically, you pick something up and it seems heavier than you think it should be. That's kind of one. If you pick up these little soldiers and they seem heavier than you think they should be. Same with lead crystal. The decanter seems a little bit heavier than you think. Lead crystal also often fluoresces this like icy blue color, which is actually quite spectacular. I think it's better than the uranium glass, to be honest. Stained glass, 99% of the time, except if it's a modern stained glass and people are being really safety conscious, is going to be lead containing. Weighted silks, literally because of the weight of the lead on it, they tend to shatter. So if you see like a silk that's in particularly like friable condition, that's one indication that they have lead in them. And then, I think any kind of paint, any sort of industrial paint before the 1970s is probably going to contain lead. So what do we do? Stained glass conservators are sort of, and stained glass workers are really these people who we see at extreme occupational exposure to lead. You have to be very cautious when you're working with lead because it's extremely pervasive. So when they do exposure assessments on lead workers, they also monitor their family and their homes and their children, because if you see people not being cautious working with lead in their work, their families are usually also have high levels as well. So you can see here, she's suited up, she's wearing a respirator, she's being extremely cautious here. And this company, even though they're taking all these precautions, often have higher lead levels than sort of the normal people walking around in the world. So it's very hard when you have lead in your environment to not be exposed to it. Arsenic. So arsenic is one of these things that it's called the king of poisons. People have been poisoning each other with arsenic since the beginning of time. It's just, everyone has known it's poisonous, which is why it's so sort of fascinating that it became so popular, particularly in the Victorian age as a pigment, which is what I'm going to talk about mostly when I'm talking about arsenic. And arsenic, and because it was so popular in furnishings and paintings and books and all of these things, this is another one where like the public outcry was enough to really motivate changes in occupational health and safety, because the people at home were getting sick, the consumers were getting sick, but also the workers were getting sick. And so usually the way that we sort of say arsenic is present in things is when you see this really vibrant green. It can also be yellows as well. The trade names for these are like Shields green, Paris green, emerald green. These are also sold as pesticides, as poison. So there is, some kind of something's not happening here, that people are also wearing things that they're using as a pesticide. The problematic thing with particularly the book cloth, which is the one in the middle here, is that it's not a dye that's applied to a fiber. So it's not, you're not dyeing a fiber and then weaving it together, and that's where your arsenic is. They're actually applying it as sort of like a paste onto the pre-woven material. So you get a really sort of friable surface of arsenic just coming off. And you read all these historical stories of just children playing with decks of cards and getting sick, and just because they have this green, they have this fascination in the Victorian period, because we're in this sort of industrialized era of like bright colors and things being green, because that's not what you're seeing outside. So they're making fake flowers and wreaths and all of these different things. Anything that has a bright green color, you should suspect has these arsenic-based pigments in them. This portrait this painting is also pulling double duty here. So not only is the wallpaper probably arsenic, but the pigments that are used for paintings also have these heavy metal pigments in them as well. So as I mentioned, this was no secret. People were aware that consumers were getting sick. The people in the factories were getting sick. And so it really forced legislation that outlawed the use of arsenic and sort of these worker health and safety policies and sort of the regard in using arsenic in this way. Here's another one you probably know about, mercury, right? So thanks to Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland, we all kind of are sort of aware of Mad Hatter's disease, right? So mercury is another one like lead that causes sort of cognitive changes. That is another reason why they're hard to sort of detect and pinpoint the cause of, because it's not like all of a sudden you're sick one day. You sort of have these subtle changes over time, and it's much harder to prove that where your exposure is coming from. So the other thing I want to mention about these heavy metals is that they are persistent in the environment, right? So we are in this age of industrialization, we're producing all of these heavy metals in the environment, and they stay there and they don't go anywhere. So we now have sort of an environmental contamination issue to talk about as well. Mercury is a great example of why the type of mercury matters. So mercury falls into 3 different categories. You have elemental mercury. This is the kind we're probably all familiar with. That's in thermometers, and it's the silvery, like liquidy kind. You have organic mercury. This is stuff that's found in the environment from industrialization. So this is the kind that fish eat. And then when we eat fish, we're exposed to it. And then inorganic mercury is mostly man-made things. They're used as pesticides, and they're also what's used in making felted hats. So here's just 2 examples of how we see mercury within historic collections. One is mercury amalgam mirrors, which we'll talk about in a minute. That's kind of my specialty, so I could talk about that for hours and hours, but spare you that. And the other is these mercury felted hats. One of the things that, and again, that my talk is called Hidden Hazards, is that you wouldn't know that this hat has mercury on it, but we can detect it, through using scientific equipment to know that there's mercury here. That we went through the museum today because there are several mirrors in the collection, and some of them you can tell are mercury right away because they have very characteristic things that we associate with mercury. But if they're in really good condition, it's hard to tell. So, some of them are hidden and some of them are not. So what happens with mercury felting is that you use mercury nitrate. It's a process called kerating. And when you treat the fur, it helps separate the fur from the skin, and it also mats the fibers together, so you get felting. This is also called Danbury shakes because there was a factory in Danbury, Connecticut, where Alice Hamilton went there again. She was one of the people that brought attention to this particular condition, where of the 100 workers that they surveyed, slightly over 40% of them had mercury poisoning, to the point where there were 20-year-olds who couldn't even feed themselves because their hands were shaking so badly. And it took a longer time than you would expect for them to sort of outlaw this process of mercury felting. But this is one of those areas where this entire area where this factory was is just contaminated with mercury. And one of the ways that they have tried to deal with that is they have these trees that they've planted that sort of take the mercury out of the ground, but then they put it into the air. So it's kind of, which is the best, which is the lots are evil. Okay, tin-mercury amalgam mirrors. I will try to keep this brief because I give a 2-hour lecture on this to my students, so because I find it so incredibly fascinating. But for most of the history of glass mirrors, mirrors were made with an amalgam of tin and mercury. So this is, you put a layer of tin foil down, you flood the whole surface with mercury, and then you put your glass down and it forms an amalgam and it sticks to the glass. Almost immediately after that process, the mercury starts coming out of the mirror, and it comes out of the mirror as liquid or vapor. This was an extremely labor-intensive process that started in about the 16th century all the way up until the mid-19th century. This is how mirrors were made. It required this very structured workshop practice. And when they finally came up with the system of silver deposition, which is kind of how the modern way of making mirrors, which is much faster and much less toxic, there was a lot of resistance, both from an aesthetic standpoint, because silver mirrors look a lot different than mercury mirrors, but also from the workers. This is a great quote that I like to read because it kind of sums up everything that I've sort of been talking about. So there's this resistance to moving to silver mirrors. The reason for this condition of things discloses one of the strange phenomena of the human mind, which have puzzled philosophers and baffled philanthropists in all ages. The mercurial process, or amalgam process, is terribly destructive to human life, an early, certain, horrible death being sure those engaged in it. For this reason, wages of this class of workmen were, in comparison with those paid in most other handicrafts, very high. And though the ultimate consequences were so dreadful, this one fact, big wages, made those who were thus employed cling with tenacity to their deadly trade and regard with hatred and disfavor all who undertook to ameliorate their condition. So they know they're getting sick from this process, but they don't want to change. They don't want to change it, and we see that today. We see that today in sort of modern health and safety scenarios as well. So this is what they kind of look like when they start to deteriorate. It is the breakdown of the amalgam and the release of the mercury is exacerbated by heat. So you can see here where these sconces have the candles, the area behind the candles is more degraded. What does this look like? You get little droplets of mercury that start to drip out of the mirrors. And you also get mercury vapor. And you can see here, they're using a little pump. This is at the University of Delaware, where they have a bunch of leaking mirrors. They are using a little pump to sort of collect the mercury because now you have a mercury spill issue. Okay. What does all of that mean? Maybe I've sufficiently scared you because you all have old mirrors in your homes. So are we actually at risk when we're handling these objects? We know that these certain hazards exist. We know the people that were using these things had health issues. So what does that mean for the rest of us that are either visiting this museum or have these in our homes or have these in our collections? You might have one, or you might have, in this case, which is the Metropolitan Museum of Art's open storage, dozens of mercury mirrors all lined up in a row. So what does that mean? So for the most part, what I've been talking about today are inherent hazards that are part of the makeup of the object. And one I neglected to talk about are botanical hazards. So we have a whole garden outside, actually, which is like, has some in it. One of my favorites is the rosary pea, which are these little seeds here. These have a very robust outer shell that is hard to puncture, but once you puncture them, they have a toxin that's about twice as potent as ricin. So so if you hold them in your hand, they're fine. If you chew it up, you're in trouble, right? So, and you see these beautiful artworks that are just covered with them. So it's like, what do we do in a museum when we have that kind of scenario? The other category are acquired hazards. So these are situations where either the inherent situation is becoming worse, like with the mercury mirrors, or they've acquired some sort of outside thing. Historically, we've applied pesticides to organic objects, things get moldy. The difference between these two categories is we tend to leave the inherent ones alone and sort of mitigate exposure. And we sometimes sort of treat the acquired ones to remove the mold or to remove the things that are happening. This is not a list that you need to read, but this is sort of just a visual to kind of give you the extent of the problem. So these are just a few of the things that I came up while I was making the slide that we have to worry about in historic collections. And then how we approach them, whether they're inherent or acquired, can be extremely different. Okay, again, are we at risk here when we're handling these objects? So there's a big distinction between the hazard, which is that something is dangerous. Mercury is dangerous, lead is dangerous. We have very clear, studies that show exposure to these things are bad. Then we have to consider what our risk is. So the risk is the probability that you coming in contact with that object, you're going to have some sort of health effect. So you can't change that we have mercury, you can't change that you have lead, you can't change these things, but you can control your risk by sort of changing your exposure with these objects and sort of understanding what your exposure is. Here's just one example of how I like to describe that. So if we assume that both of these scenarios are formaldehyde, right? We know that formaldehyde is a carcinogen. We're dealing with formaldehyde in this collection and sort of what to do with those fluid preserved specimens. The hazard here is the same. They're both formaldehyde. The risk here is not the same, right? This guy is just like, I'm going to dip my hands into some bad formaldehyde. And these people are saying, we're going to do it the right way and we're going to wear proper personal protective equipment. They have a monitor for formaldehyde. So very high risk here, very low risk here, dealing in a very similar situation. What does that mean for our historic objects, right? So is the risk of exposure the same with our leaky mirror as it is for our lead crystal? Is it the same for our books? Is it the same for our radium? People hate it when they ask me this question and I say, it depends, right? It depends. I cannot answer that question for you if you have one of these in your home. I cannot tell you what your risk is. It depends on the condition. It depends on what the object is. It depends on the history. It depends on all these things. Mostly it depends on you, right? So it depends on what the toxin you're dealing with is, how much of it is, how old you are, if you're pregnant, how long you've been exposed, the way that you're exposed. And then one of the things I really like to hammer home to my students is individual variability. Just because one person doesn't get sick from something doesn't mean that someone else won't. So the example I give here is smoking. There are many people who have smoked their entire life and will never get cancer, but that does not mean that smoking doesn't cause cancer, right? So you can't say I played with mercury mercury thermometers all the time. I played with them. I've never had mercury poisoning, right? You can't use these sort of anecdotal things to tell you what your actual risk is. So just to dive a little bit more, sort of when we are around these objects, the way that you are exposed is important. So mostly with handling these hazardous materials, there's 3 ways that you can be exposed. You can either inhale, ingest, or absorb either through your skin or your mucous membranes or your eyes. And so what does that mean for our objects, right? So mercury, elemental mercury, which is this one, it's the inhalation of the vapor that is bad. So your lungs are going to absorb a lot more of the vapor than your skin is going to absorb it if it's in your hand. So that's going back to these people who say like, oh, I played with mercury all the like it wasn't going through their skin, right? That wasn't the big route of exposure risk for mercury. The type we have in fish is a different type of mercury. That's organic mercury, and that is bad to eat. So the type of mercury there matters. Getting back to ingestion, so lead is bad to ingest. These lead containing decanters, if you are picking them up, it's probably fine. You're not getting any lead exposure. If you're storing your whiskey or your vodka or whatever, your wine or whatever those things, the lead actually, they have shown that the lead actually leaches out of these and then you're ingesting it. And then that is the significant hazard there. And then so absorption, all of these things also, yes, can be absorbed, but it's in a much lower rate than they are for these other systems. But chemicals tend to go through your skin a lot more. So when you see these chemicals, those tend to go. It's also bad to breathe or drink formaldehyde, but you also have to worry about it going through your skin. So what does that mean in like a collection environment, or if someone's going to come into your home and you're worried about your mercury mirror in your home? We look at these things in different ways. So if we were worried about an inhalation risk, we would take air samples and see if we can identify what's in the air. If we're worried about ingestion or absorption risks, we would take samples of the surface and make sure that you aren't getting, say, lead contamination around all your surfaces. That then it seems weird because you're like, I'm not going to eat my collections, but you touch something and then you forget to wash your hands and you go have a cup of coffee or you go eat your lunch and you now ingested whatever that hazard was because you didn't have good hygiene. Ideally, we take that to the next level. So for those of you who have children, you know that you go to the doctor and they measure their blood, their lead levels, because you want to know whether or not that contaminant is actually getting into your body. So we can say there's mercury vapor in the air, but we don't know whether or not you're getting that exposure. So it's kind of like if you walked into a bar and you saw someone standing next to an empty container of beer, right? You know that there was that hazard there, but you have no idea whether that container is empty because they drank it or not. So, you know, you can say that there's that hazard here, but unless you actually test the person, you don't know for sure whether or not they've been exposed to that hazard. So now we are at the reason that I am here, which is sort of putting all of this into practice. My thesis project for my recent master's degree in occupational health and safety was that I was involved in this survey of the historical pharmaceutical collection at the Shelburne Museum. It's, you know, pharmaceutical collections contain everything I just talked about and more. If there is some sort of drug, intoxicant, narcotic, heavy metal, botanical poison, all of those were sold as medicines in the 19th and 20th century, and they end up in these apothecary collections. The, you know, sort of patent medicines that were sold as like remedies for things are really what motivated laws like the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906 to really crack down on what people were selling and telling you it was okay to eat and drink and was making you better. So this is the Shelburne Museum. They are a collection of historic houses that are set up sort of like a town, but it's not an actual town. And this is the general store and apothecary shop. So the general store is actually a historic structure that was taken from another location in Vermont and brought to the site. And then the apothecary shop, which is this little building, is a modern to the 1950s building that was constructed to look like an apothecary. This is what it looks like inside. This is just one of the rooms. This is the compounding room. So this is where they would have mixed up all the concoctions. As you can see, there's a wide variety of things that we should be concerned about in this space. And they received an IMLS grant to hire a technician to inventory this entire collection and see exactly what they had and what they needed to be concerned about. When they started, they thought that they had about 5,000 containers. They now know they're a year and a half into the process and they're up to 7,000 and aren't done yet. So similar to what we have here, it's a big problem. There's not a lot of research on what you do with these collections. And so everyone is sort of, you know, treading new ground here, trying to figure out what to do. Here's a selection of my favorite things that we found. I don't know how to get rid of that on there, but you know, there's a bottle of embalming fluid that's called dioxin, right? So is it dioxin that we think of today, or is it some 19th century term used of, you know, of what dioxin is? People think it's not actually the dioxin that we think of being so toxic today. These sort of poultry compounds notoriously contain arsenic. This one is picric acid. It's used in medicinal kits, sort of like field kits for like war kits and things like that. It becomes extremely explosive over time. You know, who doesn't want to wash themselves in lead and opium? I mean, I do. And then, you know, my favorite one, which you can't really see because we're blocked there, is a cocaine and beef tonic, because beef blood and cocaine is how you soothe your 19th century stomach. Of course, everybody knows that. So there's just anything you can imagine was in this collection. And we also see that there's just a wide variety of condition and types of containers that they're in. Some of them are cracked, some of them are breaking, some have corks, some have glass stoppered. There's just too many problems to deal with, but we're going to try. So they did sort of a cursory inventory in the 1970s and they have these sort of old photos that you can't really tell very much, but what you can see is that there is a changing condition. So something is happening. A lot of these contain alcohol, and it seems to be like that alcohol is evaporating out and leaving behind some other things in there. So over the 50 years between these two surveys, something is happening in the condition. There was a smell in this space, which is how I got brought in, because as they really started getting in, they knew they had some hazardous things, but as they started doing the inventory, it was just shocking. And the technician was getting really concerned about the things that she was seeing. And sort of as we went through the building today, we kind of had similar revelations about the things that we were finding. So They wanted someone to come in. As part of the grant, they were able to get an industrial hygienist to come and sort of give them basic precautions of how to protect themselves, but they were really worried about specific hazards within the collection. Things that were explosive or particularly hazardous, they just got rid of them, and they had to have a special company come that comes with a special bomb, explosive container, and they neutralize the chemicals and they take them away. One of the things I was telling everyone earlier today that I have to explain here is that they're not vaporizing these chemicals, right? It's not solving the sustainability issue of having these hazardous chemicals in the world. They are just containing them and then taking them to another landfill site that is hazardous materials. So, this doesn't solve the problem that these are still in the world. I think that's they're not disappearing into the ether, as you would say. They are still a problem. And this is a really sort of difficult process. It's an expensive process. You have to do a public notice of the things that you're getting rid of, and you have to publicize that you're doing it and have town meetings and all of these things to get rid of them. So if we remember what I talked about earlier, lead gets everywhere. And so this is one of the concerns we had with this space. We had lead in a variety of areas. We had bottles that were topped with lead. We had things that contained lead. And then we had these mystery powders that maybe because lead forms a white powder, they might be lead. You can see here that we did these little over-the-counter lead wipes, which came up as positive. So that helped us sort of in our identification. This one is a super exciting lead arsenate. So it's a double whammy with that one. And we were able to determine that sort of these ground glass stoppered bottles are particularly bad. You open them up and the powder spreads everywhere, and it's exactly what you think it is. So here's the main area of the apothecary. And so we sampled around this space to just see how far the lead was actually spreading around this space. And it was everywhere. It was on the bottles. It was on the shelves that the bottles were on. It was on the interior casework. It is on the exterior casework. So this is where the little kids come and they put their hands and they appear in the window right there. It was on her workspace. It was on her lab coat. It was on her photo equipment. The only place that it wasn't was in these green areas, which are our controls, because we were worried about that there was lead paint in the building and that would have been contaminating everything. So we feel very confident that because of this, we are able to say that the contamination in this building is coming from the collection. And that's a really important statement to be able to make, because now they can sort of focus what their work practices are. The other important thing is that the concentrations that we're seeing are meeting or exceeding state and federal occupational and residential exposure limits. So now we have a problem when not only for our worker, but also when this building reopens to the public. So what does that mean? Like, why, it's bad news. As a student in industrial hygiene, I kept coming back to my advisor and I'd be like, we didn't find anything today. And he's like, that's good news. Like, when you don't find the contamination, you were supposed to be happy. And I was like, but it doesn't make a very exciting thesis project. So yay, we found something. But the good news there is now they're allowed to they had these general health and safety protocols, but now they're able to focus their efforts on the things that they know are there. So they can do lead specific things. They can make sure they're using proper hygiene. They can use disposable work surfaces. They can do lead specific abatement for these cabinets. And then something that's very difficult, and I think a discussion that everyone here is going to have, is sort of how you prioritize the removal of these things from your collection. And as sort of collection workers, this panics us a little bit, because we're like, what if somebody wants to study this one day? Like, what if this hypothetical person has been looking for dioxin in embalming fluid, and I just happen to have the one sample that's left in the world? So this is the discussion that I have among collections workers and health and safety professionals, is how we resolve this issue. So this is called the hierarchy of controls. This is sort of a standard, like how to reduce risk in life, but in particular with health and safety issues. This conversation is something that's a lot easier to have post-COVID because people didn't really understand this until we started talking about how effective masks are. So the first thing you want to do is you want to try to eliminate the hazard, right? So if we talk about, say, you want to paint your room, but you're worried about the chemicals in the paint, right? So you go, okay, can I like get away with not painting my room? Maybe I could do wallpaper, or like maybe that's, you know, a better solution. Maybe I can use a low VOC paint that would be a little bit better. If that's not the case, okay, maybe I can do engineering controls, which is like opening the windows and getting fresh air. If that's not the case, maybe I can use a paintbrush instead of a roller, so I'm not like creating so much vapor. And then the very last thing you want to do is personal protective equipment, because the only thing that does is protect you. So you are spreading this vapor around the room, your kids are still coming in, like you're the only one that's being protected when you're wearing this mask. Except in the case of COVID, where you are the one producing the hazard. But so that's in like a severe conflict with what our collection priorities are, because we are a whole profession that is built on preservation. And so the fact that a health and safety person comes in and tell us that we need to get rid of our collection is not something that we're happy to hear. So we tend to do other things. We tend to isolate. We tend to keep people away. We maybe can substitute something else. Do we have something else that content wise could be a better solution? And then we just wear gloves like crazy. This is what we do. We wear face masks, we wear gloves. That's sort of what our first solution is. I think that's it. Yeah. So,